Welcome back. Hope you had a good meal.
Yep.
Yeah, so we had lunch here because we're in a Pacific time zone, right? You guys out there had, whatever meal you wanted to have. And now we are going to have more XAML, which is pretty cool. So we are going to talk about controls. And, we talked a lot about layout. We talked about panels. We talked about, brushes and all that. Those are all the foundation
Primitives.
pieces, the primitives that you need in order to build a UI and a UX, a user experience and a user interface. Obviously, you need to interact with your application at some point, and this is really what controls are doing. So what's a control? It's a reusable unit that we use in the presentation layer. It has multiple purposes, and especially it has a purpose of interaction, like bringing feedback. If it's a text block, if it's a label, if it's things like that, it's a passive feedback, you would say, but very important nonetheless. Or it can react to input and then translate that to events, which is a normal .NET way of doing things, right? There is also, of course, and here we talk more about styling and theming, and we'll go into styles and templates a little bit later. But there is also the goal of having consistency with the operating system. So, for example, a lot of things have been said about Windows Phone and the Microsoft Design Language, and now it's also inside Windows RT. And of course, there is a consistency. So by bringing a set of controls and a set of styles and templates, and sometimes default styles and templates, we of course help the developers to get a very nice experience which is consistent throughout the platform. So that's a good advantage.
Yeah, so I think of controls. One thing that there's a behavior associated with it.
Yes.
So having the consistency is great for not only the look and feel, but also the behavior. Like certain, there's gestures like selection and things like that, where controls drive you that reuse. Mm-hmm. They're great for the developers because they don't have to reinvent the wheel on something that should be core of the platform.
Exactly.
And then they're great for the user because they give them that consistent. They know how to deal with that gesture, how to deal with that task that they need to do. And the control just packages it all together. There's a look, and then there's a kind of a behavior that they'll do. Like you see a button, to tap on it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll go more into this with the concept of lookless control and control template, which give actually a look to the. I think that probably in WPF, I remember back then when I saw that the first time, I thought to myself, okay, that's exactly how it should be, because you have this concept where really one person worries about what the control does, but another person or another role at least worries about how this should look like, and this is a totally different concept. So very neat separation here. Now, you have controls and you have content controls. We talked already a little bit about content control before. Remember that the button is a content control. Content control have a content property, which is actually the default property. And if we check into that, so we have two controls which are made really to contain other things or the UI or visual elements. And this is the content control and the items control. Content control, a lot actually of controls derive directly or indirectly from content control, notably button base, which I mentioned here because it's a very important one. Button, repeat button, toggle buttons are all button base, except that they react slightly differently. And radio button and checkbox are toggle buttons, which in turn is a button base, which in turn is a content control. Why do I underline this? Because the content can be anything, so it can be an object, which means that it's very easy actually, that's the compulsory kitten that you have in every technical session. On the left, I have a text, which is rendered, of course, if you fire XAML Spy, you will see that it is a text block eventually, which is rendered here. But really, the content is just a string, so then there is a type converter doing that. But on the right, I can have pretty much any content, not pretty much, any content inside the button. And I could even have a panel, which in turn contains children elements. So you can have really a very nice composition like that.
Yep.
User control, we'll talk about user control a little bit more in a moment. It's a way to logically group elements, and that's also a content control, which is interesting. So it has a content. Again, right, I want to stress that there can be only one element as the content of a content control, but this element can be a panel, which in turn can contain any number of children. Now, items control is another one which is very clever in all XAML-based framework, because it's basically a list of things that you represent. And it has common properties such as item source, where the items come from, such as the item template, how do they look like, etc. And all those elements, listbox, data grid, tree view, toolbar, tab control, grid view in Windows 8, the list view, are all actually deriving from items control. So when you use one of those elements, you have a familiarity, and even though a tab control doesn't look like a list box, under the hood, I forgot to put combo box here, but that's also the same. Under the hood, it's the same. It's a list of items which have a representation. Items control, one thing that I didn't know when I started WPF, I still remember to that day, that one day I realized that items control is not abstract. So you can actually use items control as an element, as a visual element, and fill it. And for example, that can be useful in certain cases, such as when you don't want virtualization, when you want to have all your elements created as soon as the application starts. That can be a useful scenario. So that would be the content model. Let's talk a little bit about core controls. Those are the controls that you will find in almost every application, or most of them. A button, okay, we talked about that. It has a click event, so in terms of behavior, we know what it does. A toggle switch is actually based on the toggle button, which is based on the button, right? On the button base, so it has an is-checked property. The checkbox doesn't look like a toggle switch, but it is almost exactly the same. So if it means that, for you down in your data object, you can have just an is-checked property. And up there, the designer is going to decide, do I want rather a toggle switch experience or rather a checkbox experience? Radio buttons are like checkboxes, but they are mutually exclusive. Progress ring, progress bar indeterminate, which we use quite a lot for every asynchronous operation where you don't know how long it's going to take. You should show something to your users, so we use the progress bar, especially on the phone and in Windows 8. Or in Windows 8, you can also have the progress ring experience, sliders, etc. Few other core controls, text box, obviously, to have input-output. Password box is just a special type of text box where you have some behavior, such as hiding the characters. On Windows 8, the password box has a small eye icon that you can tap in order to see your password very fast if you're not sure what you tapped. Text boxes can be multi-line. Images, we mentioned images in media element before. Combo box, list box, again, very, very similar control. It's just a visual appearance which is different, and you can easily swap one with the other without having to change your data model at all. Pop-ups are primitives that are used for all kinds of goodies, like for example, when you swipe from the left and then you have, well, this one not really, but the settings, for example, under the hood, that will be based on pop-up element with some specific behaviors. Okay, date picker, time picker, those were in Windows 8, for example, were just added actually to Windows 8.1, so good news, you don't have to write your own anymore, it's really good. WebView is kind of a specific case because it is really a surface in which you can render HTML, and this HTML can be either external, so point to a URI and then render, in that case, bing.com, or you can even render a string. So you can say, well, I want to create some HTML on the fly, render it. And in Windows 8.0, for the people who have this experience, it had a lot of issues with airspace, etc. That had been really cleaned up in 8.1, and now you have a beautiful experience also with the web view.
Yeah, so our web view, in WPF, the web view was kind of a window, and you can put stuff in front of it. And Windows 8, the Windows Store 8 model has that same problem. So airspace is where you have one element that's kind of a window, nothing can go in front of it because of the way the compositor is dealing with it. He draws that topmost over everybody else.
Correct.
And we've fixed that on 8.1. On Windows Phone, you can already composite things with web views. So
which is very convenient because think about the scenario where you want to log into Twitter, for example, or Facebook. Mostly those use actually a login dialog which is external to the application, or SkyDrive does the same, right?
Yep.
The whole live.com experience. So sometimes you need that to render this, and then you don't have to worry too much about that. You have also events, so you will know when the page is loaded, when it is navigating, navigated, all these kind of events. You can even communicate with the JavaScript, which is running within the web view in two directions. So you can listen events, JavaScript events, or you can actually execute code a little bit like the eval does in JavaScript. You can actually compose your JavaScript methods and then evaluate that inside the web view. So really a very nice integration of both worlds here.
And we should say, we took 3 slides for core controls, but there's a lot more.
There are more.
I picked those just because I thought, hey, they're in HTML, they're in, like, for example, iOS with Cocoa. They're in other frameworks out there. So I picked the ones that I thought, hey, people are going to be looking for these.
Absolutely.
Let's just make sure you know that, they're there. Later today, we're going to cover some Windows and phone-specific controls. And then there's a whole lot of things like scroll viewers and other things that we just didn't cover. So when you look at those 3 slides, don't assume, oh, this is all there is. We just picked everybody should expect this. These are there. We just want to make sure you feel comfortable.
And by the way, a quick tip, right? If you look for documentation for any control, the fastest way is to go into any browser. Here I'm into IE, but it works with any browser. And just type, for example, border class, enter, and usually the first one that comes up is actually the MSDN entry. So as soon as you have the word class after your type name, you will find the documentation. There is really awesome documentation on MSDN about all those. You can see in which frameworks they do run. Silverlight includes the phone, for example. You see the whole hierarchy. So really a wealth of information. So again, right, check what do you have at your disposal, and then check the documentation to learn to use those. So we are going to do a demo at this point of controls. So a few things I wanted to show, and I think that one thing which is interesting is how do you actually build a control, right? What is a control made of? And we talked before about this concept of lookless control. So what does it mean really? Well, what it means is that I'm going to create a control, and then I'm going to worry about the behavior of this control first. And only later I'm going to worry about how it looks like. So let's go here into a WPF application that would work exactly the same in, in all other XAML frameworks. I'm going to add a new item. And here I have something called custom control, which for other frameworks might be named as templated control. This is exactly the same. So here I have custom control. I'm going to leave the name, it's fine. And then I'm going to say add. And this is adding 2 things, actually. This is adding the class itself, which is a totally standard class, right? The only thing that it does is deriving from controls, that's all. But in addition to that, it adds, if it was not there already, a themes folder, and inside there is a generic.xaml. Now those names are actually conventions, so don't change them. And inside generic.xaml, this is where you will have the look and feel, or at least the default look and feel for your control. We'll come back to that in a second. In WPF, you often have hats. So I have my developer hat. I don't worry about the rendering at all. Now I'm going to give a few information to the tools about my control. I'm going to tell the tools what does this control do, what does it need in order to function. And I'm going to add some attributes to do that. Here we go. So what do we have here? Well, the first thing we have a template part. Now the name of the part is clickable. It could be anything. And here I expect a button. That's going to help the tool to know what kind of elements can be made that. Now, if you are curious about what template parts do you have in a control, you can actually go into here the documentation. Let's look for scroll bar, for example. Here we go. And if you look into that, this is where you will find actually the information about those things. Like, for example, here I have a template part attribute. It is expecting a track. That's like the minimum things that you need to define in your template if you want the control to work as it is expected, right?
On WPF and Silverlight, we document template parts of Visual State this way. On Windows Store, we no longer do it that way, but you can query onto Blend APIs and get the documentation, and they're also on the Dev Center listed and enumerated. So
correct.
But it's the concepts that people are after. People need to remember here that there's a part. You're defining kind of the parts of the look and feel, and then you're going to define the states.
Exactly. So here I had the part, and like you nicely segued, I also have the template visual state. attribute, which tells me what state my control can be in. So think about a button, right? It can be normal, or it can be hover when the mouse is over it, or it can be clicked, or it can be disabled. Those are all kind of, the common states, right? And then maybe you have also another family of states, which is the focus states, because the button can be clicked and have the focus, but it can also be clicked and not have the keyboard focus, right? So you have those two which are composed. So within a state family, within a state group, those are mutually exclusive, but they can be composed together. So here I define a group name. Those are the toggle state for my control, and I can have normal or toggled. I could define more if I want. Obviously, there is no limit here. Now, my control itself, there are a few things which are interesting. So here it is WPF, so it's using the syntax here to actually know where do I look for the default style, and I have this default style key property. In other frameworks, it is a slightly different syntax, but anyway, file new item, new templated control, and then you will see immediately how it works. This is going to help me to find the template, the default template for this button. Now I'm going to add here two things. So I have here the is toggled Boolean, which is going to help me keep track of the state of the control. And here I have the clickable button. I'm going to keep it just because I want to attach events, detach events. And then I need to actually get this button. So how do I do that? Now I know that I mentioned to the developer who is using my control, it would be good if you give me a button and you name it clickable. It's not a must, but it would be good if you expect my control to react like it should. So let's go and override the onApplyTemplate method. And here inside onApplyTemplate, this is a method which is called when the template has been applied, and then I can look into the template, into the visual representation for what I'm looking for. Now inside onApplyTemplate, what I'm going to check is getTemplateChild, which is a method of the control, so it's convenient. I'm looking for that name, and I'm going to map it, to cast it to a button. Now notice that I use the as button. Why do I do that? Well, it's because, as I said, the attributes are an indication to the user. You should probably do that when you do your template. But maybe somebody thinks he's clever and gives me a scroll bar which is named clickable. I don't want my application to crash at this point. So instead, by using the as keyword, this might be null. And this is something you always have to keep in mind when you create control. Your parts, there is no guarantee that you will get them. So here, if it is not null, I will attach an event handler to it. And in that case, I know it's a button. Well, or else it would be null, right? And then I can move on. And then when I click on the button here, I will do a few things. First of all, I will toggle the state of the control, but I will also use here the Visual State Manager to go to a given state. We are going to talk a little bit more about the Visual State Manager a little bit later, but this is the first encounter where we see, oh, interesting. So here I have states. Remember that those states within the group are mutually exclusive. So here I have normal and toggled. For a button, you also have, for example, the disabled state, which can be helpful, etc., etc. Now, the goToState method needs the control itself, okay, because this is a manager. It's going to do something. It's going to take the name of the state that you want to go into, and then it's going to take a Boolean, which indicates if you want transitions to happen or no. And we'll understand that better when we see how we create the template with the state. But basically, I can already say that you want this to be false when you initialize your control. When the control goes into the initial state, you typically don't want transitions. You want the button to be immediately in the correct state. If, however, there is an action of the user, you typically want transitions because it's going to be smoother. Okay, so my control is actually already done. So now I can switch my hat and take my designer hat. And let's take a look at here, the generic.xaml. And this is here what Visual Studio created for me. It creates actually a style. And notice that there is no key. So this is an implicit style. It's going to be applied to all items of type custom control 1 inside this namespace. And here I have the template. And the template is a control template. So this defines the visual look and feel of my application. The only element here is a border, and the background, border brush, and border thickness are set. Now this is really Visual Studio helping you and thinking, okay, probably he's going to do that at some point, so I might as well do it for him, but you can also just remove that and start from scratch if you prefer.
Yep.
An important scenario that we see here, there is this template binding keyword. I think we go more into bindings later, but just a word to explain what that makes, right? So the border here is within the template. But of course, for the background of this border, I would like, if as a user I take my control and I set my control.background equals yellow, somebody has to take care of this yellow visually inside the template. So here, the border says, hey, I'm going to take care of the background property of my control, of the controls that me as a template element I represent, okay? So this is what template binding does. It's a special type of binding. It says, let's look into the binding. And before, a good example of that is padding versus margin. So when you have a content element inside a template, you want the margin of this content element to be set. But actually what the user is setting is actually the padding, right? Because he has the border, which is the root of the element. And then within that, he wants to put some distance. So he will set the padding property, but somewhere into the template, you will say, oh, this element here, the margin equals template binding padding, for example. And like this, I take reference to the padding element of my control.
So if we look at the parts, I want to make sure people are not getting lost, because this is complex. So what we did is you inherited from control.
Yes.
And so there is a predefined class and the control class, and that has all kinds of properties like background, width, height, all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And one really special property is this property called template.
Yes.
Which is a control template, and that's what's defining the look and feel.
Yes, exactly.
And then what you're doing here is you're creating a little style that's creating that template. So you're defining the visuals that are going to go into that control.
Correct.
So for example, if you think about a button, which I'm sure you'll show later, the control template for a button, it's kind of a rectangle with some text inside of it, right? Or it might be more rectangles because of the visual states. And that's all we're doing. So all we're telling people here is, hey, here's how it works. There's a class, there's, so which defines the behavior. And at this point, that's kind of like you had a width, height, all this stuff, and then you're defining a new look and feel for a new type of button, and you added some states because your buttons are going to do that.
That's correct, exactly. That's exactly that. So what I'm going to do now is go into Blend, and I'm going to open the same application. So now I have the same application opened in both environments, which is something that is pretty common, right? I'm going to make sure that I build my application, just to make sure that everything is up to date, that I find my controls and all that. And I can build directly in Blend, or I can build in Visual Studio. It doesn't matter. And now I'm going to want to do a visual design for this control. So again, I have my other hat, right? So I can go into the assets library, and I'm going to look for the custom controls that I just created. Now, because I built, Blend does some exploring and finds, oh, there is a custom control one. Can drag and drop. And now I don't see anything. Well, why don't I see anything? It's because it's using the default style and template. The default style and template has a border, and this border, the background of this border is a template binding to the background of the control. Now here I have nothing set as the background of this control. If I change that, however, now we see, oh, okay, it's coming, right? So if I go here and I decide, let's just remove this.
Or hard-code it to a color.
So I could hard-code it to a color, for example. Let's do that. So here, if I say green, okay, I'm just going to rebuild quickly to be sure that I have everything up to date. And I reload. And now whatever I set as the background of this button, it's going to stay green because I don't have the template binding, which is the dynamic way of taking advantage of that. Okay.
And the control right there still has, if you explore into the control and you say, hey, what's your background? It's going to say it's red.
Yeah.
What's happening is that the control template, the border is not connected anymore. That's what the template binding does.
Absolutely, exactly. So we can just go back here. And now what I'm going to do is the reason why it doesn't change that when you do things on controls like that, you need to rebuild. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is actually change this default template, and I'm going to replace it with something else that I define. okay? So let's go and do that. I'm going to go here. You can go here into the Chrome bar, or you can go here into Object, and then Edit Template. And here I can do two things. I can either start from scratch, where I get really an empty space, or I can say Edit a copy. It's going to take this default guy and copy it, and here it's going to name it to something of my preference. Yep. We talked about resources. This is here a resource creation process. Yep, okay, exactly. So I'm going to say I can put it into the application because I want it to be global, or into this document because it's just going to be used into this page. Now, what do I see? Well, I see that it copied the border. So it's exactly the same XAML. This XAML here has been copied one-to-one, which is really cool because if you go and take a more complex control, we are going to do that in just a second, then you get already all the goodies, and maybe you just want to customize a little bit. Think about a scroll bar, which is a pretty complex control, or even more complex, a scroll viewer, which has 2 scroll bars, right? That can be really hard. So now I can take here this border, and remember what I know about my control is that I would like to have here a clickable, an element named clickable of type button. So let's try that. So I'm going to add a button here. Let's add a little bit of margin so that we see the background of the thing. I'm not going to modify the template of the button right now, but I'm going to name it clickable because this is how my control can find it and can do something, okay? And now I'm going to say, oh, remember, another thing I know from the documentation is that I have 2 states. Actually, I don't even need to look at the documentation. Blend is going to explore that. And if I go to the states panel here, while I am inside the template, I'm going to see those states here. The toggle states, which is a name that I define, have normal and toggled. Now I can define the look and feel for those 2 states. So I can say, well, if it's normal, it's going to be the default. But if I go into toggled, and now notice what happens, Blend goes into a recording mode. Everything I change now is going to be applied only in the toggled state. Yep. So I can say this border here should be, well, I cannot change that right now. So let's do something else. I'm going to empty here the base. I'm going to add, I'm going to add here this clickable button within a grid. Why do I want a grid? Because I can have only one element inside the border. Yep. Okay. I'm going to take this grid, remove here the margins to make it take the full size. I'm going to add margins here on this button, which is what I had before. And now I'm going to add inside the grid, I'm going to add a background here behind the button. And I'm going to set this to yellow, for example, and I'm going to make it 0% opacity. So I make it invisible. Okay? So this will be the default state. Now, if I go into toggled, then I want this rectangle here to be visible. So I go here and I say the opacity must be now 100%. You see what happened? Blend changed the name, or actually assigned the name to the element, because this is how the Visual State Manager works. It's going to take an element by name. And if I expand, I see that the opacity changed. You see you have this small star here. It means that the opacity has changed in this state. But if I go back into normal, I can see that. Now, and if you think especially of buttons, they typically have a small animation during those transitions. And if you remember, if we go back here to the control, I said that I want to go into the normal or toggled state with animations, with transitions. Yep. So this is what I can define here. And here I have a beautiful UI in Blend to do that. I can say the transition from normal to toggled is going to take 0.5 seconds. And the transition from toggled to normal is going to take 0.2 seconds, for example. Yep. Now, in addition to changing that, which is already not bad, you can even give it an easing, otherwise known as animation. So it's going to tell you, I want to start slow and end up fast, or I want to start fast and end up slow. For an opacity animation, you can, for example, think about a button. And by customizing this, I don't want to go further into the detail, but by customizing those animations and those things like that, you give a different look and feel to your application very easily. That can take a lot of time, to get it right, but it's actually pretty nice. Okay, so now I have my state, and you see that really you have this neat separation where on one hand I took care of what my button did. Well, if it's clicked, it go into a state, but I didn't care at all of how it actually looks like. And then I put my other hat and I have the other scenario where now I'm a designer or an integrator, and I say, okay, now I'm going to take care of the states and how they look like. Okay, we can quickly run this just to show that it actually works. Here is the button. If I click, we have here the toggling of the state, and you see there is this animation. So it's long when it goes to yellow, but it's faster when it comes back, and you have this neat effect.
Yep.
So that's the basis.
Well, and that's the concept. It's very much, this is like panels or kind of like dependency properties where we started earlier, and I said we're telling people how this works.
Sure.
Right now, we don't expect people to go out and create a lot of controls. They wouldn't have to.
Mostly they don't.
So for example, like you could have done, this was similar enough where you could have done something like taking a button and then swap
or a toggle
template,
button, which exists, for example, and swap the template.
Yep.
Yeah.
So for example, if you don't mind, go into Blend. So if you're projecting, or I can go into Blend and just add a regular button, something that is not custom
Absolutely,
at all.
let's do that quickly.
Yep.
And then I'll show a little bit more complicated one. So this is a totally normal button.
No custom code from you
Nothing at all, nothing
exactly.
at all. This is totally a normal button. Now I can go edit a copy of the template.
Exactly.
And now you see this is what Microsoft intended when they developed the button. They have a border, which is going to be bound through template bindings to different properties of the control, background, border brush, etc. The yellow here in Blend indicates that this is a binding, by the way. And then you have a content presenter, because remember that button is a content control. So it's going to just present whatever content the user decided to put. And here in that case, it's going to be aligned, middle, center and center, through template bindings as well, because in a button you can change the horizontal content alignment and the vertical content alignment, which are going to influence that. So very easy to understand how control works.
So
this
here
way.
You can blow away the template.
Yeah, so what I can do, for example, is let's just remove here the background on those. Here, now I have a control which is, my background is totally invisible, and instead I can take an ellipse.
Exactly.
Oops, wrong one. I forgot that I need to
the content presenter.
Group into a grid. Okay, let's make this grid here take the whole space, and now I'm going to add into the grid an ellipse.
Exactly.
Here we go. We can make it red, and then we can make it take the whole space. Here we go. And now I have my ellipse, which means that because this ellipse is active, this grid here, remember the background is null, so it's not going to react to clicks. So I have a true elliptical button. It's not like in HTML where we're kind of faking it with transparent PNGs, right? But if you click in the corner, it's actually going to react. Here, if I click in the corner, and I can show that quickly. So now I do the template, right? Now I go back to my application. Now this is a totally standard button, so it has a click event.
Yep.
Test click. I'm going to jump into here the editor, and now I can say message box dot show hello. Oops, like that. And probably I need to say that this is a system.messageBox. But anyway, point being that you can really do your things like that. And here it's really going to react only when I click. What is Blend doing now? Here we go. It's going to react really when I click on the button and not in the corner, because this is transparent. Yep. So you can customize as you want. Last example I want to give for these controls, if I take really a complex control, for example, let's go and take a scroll bar. So when you have a scroll bar, what you have is multiple areas which can be clicked, right? So you have here on top with this small arrow, this is actually a button, but it's not any kind of button. It's a repeat button, because if you click and hold, it's going to keep incrementing. Now, another thing you can think about is what happens if I click here on the scroll bar? Well, the element is going to move, but with a large value, with a large difference. It's because I also have a repeat button here, but it's another one, and it's actually transparent. Transparent to the eye, but not to the mouse. And here I have an element which I can drag. Now in WPF, in XAML in general, we call that a sumb. It's a special type of control, and I can place it. Now if I open here the template, edit a copy, I should find all these elements. And here I see that I have this arrow on top, which is actually this path here. So I can easily replace it with something else, right? It's a path, remember? So if I have a path, I can go and modify it. For example, taking this guy here, I can make it here something like that, or I could just go and remove this point altogether, okay? I have this element here, which is a repeat button. You see that in the XAML. I have the track here, which has another repeat button. That's what I mentioned before. And I have in the middle the sumb, which I can actually drag. Now this sumb, because it's a control, it is also going to have a template. So I can also go into edit template, edit current. And now I see that I just have a rectangle. But if I wanted to make something a little bit more like Blend, which has rounded corners here, I can very easily do that by changing the radius X to something like 1010, for example, or oops, 10.1, 10.10, here we go. And now I have a sum which is rounded. So you can modify the look and feel of any control very easily, or in some cases, really spend a lot of hours getting exactly the pixel fidelity that you want. You have those two possible experiences.
But again, you didn't write a single line of code here.
No, it's all
So
XAML.
that's where the power of XAML and templating comes from. Right? The one thing you didn't change was you did not change the behavior.
No.
Right? So, that scroll bar, the scroll view that you had, it still behaves like that. You can change all the look and feel. In some cases, you can remove parts and kind of break it or
exactly.
change its
So
behavior.
like I mentioned, for example, this big repeat button that I have here, I could remove it, and then what I lose is the large difference, the click, which is a large difference. I just have the small difference, right? So you can modify the behavior a little bit, but it's actually not the behavior that you're modifying. It's actually the way to access the behavior.
It's not what we're after. We didn't.
No.
We don't want you to break the behaviors there.
No, but that said, controls are classes, which means that you can always inherit that. We do that a lot. Think about the text box. A common way to do a text box with a how do you say that, a watermark, right? Like the small search text, right? Well, you have two things that you can do. You take the text box you inherit, you add a property which is called watermark, and then after that you take a template, the template of a text box, you edit it in Blend, you add, a label which is binding to that watermark, and already you have it. So it's very easy to extend controls with additional features. And this is why in WPF, even though you absolutely do have control vendors, but often just by modifying the template of a control or by inheriting a control and modifying it, you can already reach the desired effect.
And this is a huge, like I remember back to Windows Forms, and the way I used to think about it was, when I was a dev manager for Windows Forms, it was for big shop that we did Windows Forms. It was I used to go in there and the project manager or the program manager would say, "Oh, Jaime, we need to modify the look and feel so it does this," and that was a 3% delta, and I was like, "No problem, 5 minutes." And then they would say, "Oh, we need it to be like round the corners," and then I'll be like, "Oh no, that just went from being 5 minutes to being 3 days worth of work." And they could not comprehend why there was this kind of, like we used to call it, the owner draw cliff, because you go from "Oh, I need a little customization" to "Oh, I have to rewrite the whole thing." Right, and with WPF, you never have that, right?
Nope,
you can write your own custom control, and control vendors go in there and write grids and things that we don't have. But if you just want to tweak a button, or if you want to tweak a template, a checkbox, etc., that's very easy to do. And there's no owner draw cliff. It's much more. You're much more agile if you can go that route. And designers are much happier because they can go into Blend and take care of it. They don't have to be. I used to have a favorite. Round the corners was. Designers used to say, "Well, Jaime, we almost don't believe you anymore." Because when we were in Windows Forms, we used to tell people, there's 3 things you just cannot do. Like we hated doing gradients, we hated doing around the corners, because it was a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
And with WPF, then they started taking advantage of it, and then it became, now we want gradients and opacity and all kinds of things. And it was really great to not have to tell them no. So it's a huge advantage.
No, it is really, and another thing that I really like in XAML is that I also don't have to say no to my designers. I can really tell them, just be crazy as you want. I don't mind because I know that I can implement it, you know? And this is really nice. We really have, and in fact, when we hire designers who come from, typically from HTML, for example, we have to teach them that you know, you can come with whatever UI you want. I'm going to be able to render it.
Yep.
Okay, another things I wanted to talk about now is user control. So we talked about the control here. This is just a standard control, or in WPF, we often talk about custom controls. Sometimes we also talk, like on the phone, about templated control, but actually the class is control and nothing else. Now there is also another class which is called user control. So I just want to show the difference quickly. And it's really about the logical grouping of elements. So let's say that I have here an ellipse and that I have a button. I'm just going to compose something which doesn't quite make sense, but just to show an example. And I say, oh, I want to use that in multiple places. Well, maybe it would make sense. In Blend, I can here right-click and say, make into user control. Now, what's going to happen is that it's actually going to create a new file, actually 2 new files to be exact. It's going to create a new XAML file, and it's going to create, if I go and see into the project here, it's going to create also the associated code behind. Now, notice the difference with the custom control. I have my code here, but the template is kind of, you know, relegated into this themes folder, right? And in fact, I could remove that one and it would work just the same. I would just rely on the user to actually do the template. User controls don't work quite that way. So user controls are less about reuse and more, well, reuse outside of the application, and more about reuse within the application and about logical grouping of elements. So here I have my user control, I have my ellipse, my button. I can actually do some data binding if I want. For example, I can say this ellipse here, the field should be bound. I'm not going to do a template binding because I'm not inside the template. I'm inside something else. I'm going to bind to an element, to the user control, and I'm going to take the background property of that. So it's a different scenario. In that case, it is not set, which is why the ellipse is transparent.
Yep. I would say a user, or for me, the way I think about it is a control, a custom control. You know, it has a template that we expect users to customize and change the look and feel. To me, a user control is like the aggregation of an already pretty well-defined behavior, something like search, right? Search tends to have a text box with a button right next to it.
Exactly.
So it's a perfect, hey, let's just drive a way of reuse it, but we don't expect it to customize. Now, one of the things that you do get is that a user control, like everything else, is part of the visual tree.
Yes.
So if you decide, hey, I want a user control, and this user control is, you know, kind of referencing resources and brushes and things that are going to be part of my brand, then this will carry through.
Absolutely.
Right. So there is some level of customization there, but you should never, like a user control, you would never be overriding the template.
That's correct.
Because then you would break it. So that's kind of how I draw the separation.
No, that's true. That's a fair. I think that's a fair thing. And really, the customization part is true. If you expect to heavily customize the look and feel of a control, probably a user control is not the best. Instead, rather choose a custom control. Another use case for user control, by the way, is as soon as you have a UI which is composed, you can easily say, okay, I have a border which is my content container or whatever you call that, and then at runtime you say, okay, make a new user control and plant it inside this border. Or then later we navigate to something else. This is actually how the navigation pretty much works in Windows 8 and Windows Phone. Under the cover, we don't see that, but under the cover. And you can say, well, okay, now I want, the user did that, so I want to load another user control. So really for this kind of very logical encapsulation of elements, it's really a very good thing. So now that I have my user control, I can go back into. Notice that this yellow thing here means, oh, I need to build, okay, because I made changes to my user control, and I have a problem somewhere. What was the issue? Oh, okay, that's the message box that I added before. I wanted to be clever and
just remove the system.
Yeah, I'm just going to.
If you remove system, that should be enough.
Oh, okay, yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to show that anyway. But now I am okay. So my window here is good. Now I can go and say copy paste, right? And now I have a second version of this one. Now if I start to customize it, well, it can become a little bit weird because I didn't pay attention to the layout here. So here I have a large custom control, a large user control, but I didn't implement here the adaptive layout that I should have in that case. So two different types of controls, reusability, both of them are reusable, but maybe one of them rather, inside a given app, the other one rather as a, typically custom controls are inside an assembly, and then they are, referenced by multiple applications. I think that every developer who does any work has a utility library with different controls, like the watermark text box that I mentioned before is a well-known one. Okay, so that would be that. So let's progress and talk about styles and templates. And here we are going to be, we already actually touched a little bit about that. Styles and templates are resources. We have resource dictionaries. So what is really a style? A style is a collection of setters which you can assign to an object, I would say. It is grouped into a style object, so it is reusable. You can reuse the same style throughout your application. Usually it's a resource. I don't think I ever encountered the case, well, maybe we could think of some edge cases where it makes sense to have a style which is really local only, but typically the use case for a style is reusing a look and feel throughout your app.
Yep.
Remember that styles, and we saw that when you did the dependency property sample, styles are not very high in the priority array of the dependency property. Meaning that if you set a style and you say, okay, the background property is red, but if locally you set the background property of this element, of the element using the style to green, the element is going to be green. It's not going to be red because the style, of course, has less priorities than the local. So think about the generalization specificity, how do you say that? Specificity or whatever scenario where you have a general use case where, okay, I want all my buttons to be green, except that particular one because it wants to have the same other features, but it should be rather red, these kind of things. So here we have a button, we define a style. So this button here, this is actually a Silverlight button. This is a default look and feel for a Silverlight button. And it actually doesn't have a style, which means that it has a style, but it's a default style because every element must have a style and a template. Otherwise, it's not going to appear on the screen at all. Controls are lookless. So here we have the default, and I'm going to override the default here, and this is the result. Now, what you can do with a style is limited. You can set properties. For example, I can change the background color of this button, but I cannot make this button completely round, for example, because that would modify the shape of the button, not just the property, but really the shape of the button. If you want to modify the shape, then you have to go into templates, which we'll see in a second. Yep. Another example of style, I define a style element. I define a set of properties to modify this text. I can use this style in other places in my application. Here we have the blend experience. So if you do edit style, if I right-click on this text block, edit style, I can go to apply resource, and then I see all the style which are suitable for this text block. When you define a style, you have to say which type you want to target so that the parser knows. Another thing which is interesting, you can actually inherit styles. So it's a cascading scenario, just like CSS. You can have a based on style. Well, you can have a style, and this style is based on another one, which is like the parent, if you want. And here too, if you have a property defined in the based on style, and you override this property in the style itself, it's of course going to have precedence over the based thing. So like here we have an extension. I do a normal style for a button. I define another button, and here notice here it is based on a static resource named base button, which is this one. But in addition to that, I override, well, I set font size and font weight, and I override the background. Here it is set here in the base, but I overwrite it, and then we have something else.
Yep. So.
All right.
Yes. And so there's two things about styles. There's three different ways to kind of resolve or apply styles, right? One of them would be by name. Mm-hmm. So when you create your resources collection, you can go into a reference style by name. So say, hey, all of these buttons are going to have, this style. You just reference it with a static resource like we talked about earlier, right? You can also do kind of implicit where you just say, look, this style, the target type equals button, and don't give it a key, because that's the name. If you don't give it a key, then all buttons from there down on the visual tree will look the same.
Yes.
Right? So you can go about it those two ways.
That's what we call implicit style, for example.
Style.
Yeah.
Right. So that way you can go back and do it by name.
Correct.
You can define it inline, or you can do it implicit.
That's correct.
Yep.
Okay, so lookless controls, this is kind of a recap. We said, okay, a control has a behavior, it does something, but it is a separate visual implementation. So there are really two different workflows and two different files and two different roles here. One role which is a developer defining the control, what it does, and one role which is what we at IdentityMind call the integrator, defining how the control looks like.
Yep.
This is defined in XAML, defined by a designer typically in COMS. We, again, implement it using an integrator role, like I'm an integrator, for example. And usually you have a default style, just because otherwise when you place a button, you're not going to see anything, which is very confusing. So you want to make at least a very simple style with a template, just to give an indication to your user. And then the user can go and refine it, make it like he wants. Template, so that's the visual representation. So if you have a button, that's another button. It's actually the same button, but except it looks different.
Yep.
That's another button. It's still the same button, but it looks different. This is an application bar button in Windows 8, and then we could even go crazy and make any kind of button, really. Now, the button is still going to react the same. The behavior of the button here is click. There is a click event. It's really that. So somewhere, like I did the control template before, somewhere said, hey, there is a root, which can be whatever framework element, and then there is a mouse left button down event. I'm going to attach to that. When this is clicked, then I'm going to raise my own event, which is called click. That's how it's implemented.
Yep, exactly.
You can edit a template. We did that already. So you can edit current, which is really editing the current template that it is using. Remember the scroll bar. The scroll bar, I actually edit a copy. Okay, so I take the default style and I copy it, then I can modify it. Or you can create empty, which is really when you start from scratch. Rule of thumb, I would say for very simple controls like a button, I start from scratch because it takes me more time to actually remove what I already have. For any other control, typically I start with a copy and then I customize it.
I think you're farther ahead of most people. I would give people the advice that always create a copy.
It's a good,
and then hack away, because you've been doing it for 5 years.
I know. Well,
more. or for longer. And so yeah, the advice I would give people is always hack away.
Yeah.
Until you become a master at it.
I agree.
It's easier and
No, I think thank you for naming me a master. No, just kidding. I think the editor copy has a huge learning effect. So a huge teaching effect, because you learn how somebody else who knows how to do things, in that case the Microsoft people who actually wrote the framework, intended the control to be defined, right? So really a huge value, and I recommend in absolutely everybody to try at least a few times edit a copy before they move on.
For example, button has that content presenter.
Yep.
And it has like 50 properties set.
Yeah.
So I can never, like, if I ever blow it away where I accidentally delete it, I can never set everything back, because there's so many bindings, there's so many template bindings into it.
Yeah.
So I'm like, if you ever edit a button, first thing you do is copy the content presenter so that you
just to be sure, yeah, absolutely.
So that's just kind of where I go from copy. Yep.
All right, template binding, we mentioned that already in the demo. So you want the template to actually take reference, if you can show my screen, to actually take reference on some properties which are defined within the control. For example, background padding, border brush, and all that. So I showed how to do that. It's actually pretty simple. Template binding connects properties, so it takes the control properties which are lookless, again, and it projects them, it puts them on the screen in a visual manner inside the template, so you can have a very neat experience this way. So here we have, for example, this control has internally a text block. Actually, it doesn't have anything else, but this is just an example. And the text of this text block is going to be set to the text property of this control through a template binding.
Yep.
All right, user control, we already saw a small example right now, but just to recap, so this is a logical grouping of items. It can be reused. In the contrary of a custom control, a user control always have a XAML front end and code behind, while a custom control has really code and possibly a template if the developer was, decided to do that. So that's a big difference. We talked already about that. Okay, style, templates, controls. So controls, the demo, I already showed that. Let's quickly see here a few examples with styles. So if I take, for example, a good place to start with a style is with a text block, because you are going to want to style your text block. And this is typically something that we are going to reuse throughout the application. For example, if I want to have a header in my application. So typically, how do? I set my properties locally. I say, well, for example, the foreground, I want this style to be red. I want here the font to be 36, and I want here Sego UI, why not, etc., etc. And then I'm going to say, now that I'm probably going to reuse in quite a few places inside my application. So let's create a style object, edit style. And here I'm going to start with an empty style. And I'm going to say this is my header style, okay, or header text style, whatever. And now I can go and start copying those elements inside my style. So now notice that here in objects and timelines, the focus changed. Now I'm in the context of my style. So I can go and say, okay, this foreground property is set, obviously, because it's red. But here the small peg is transparent. So it is not set locally inside my style. So I can go and say convert to local value. And now it's going to convert to a property inside the style, and I have the small peg. How does it look like in XAML? Well, basically, I just added a setter, and I said the property foreground has a value of red. All the things that I said before, I set here the font size, and we can even copy here this font family. Now, things that you don't want to put into the style are things that are going to change very often. For example, it doesn't make sense for a text block to put the text property within the style. Maybe if you really want to have a default, but normally you're not going to have a default. It's going to be set locally. Once my style is defined, I can exit and go back to the page, and I can create here another text block. And then I'm going to go into Object, Edit Style. And this time I'm going to apply a resource, and I'm going to take here header style. And now both of my text block have the same style. Now this one locally is going to say page 2, because I want to have that into another page. This one is page 1, for example. Yep. So you can see that it can have absolutely different values, but they look the same.
And these are just, can you show them real quick what's going on? So go to the static resource call.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So show them that what you did there is you have style equals, and in this case is WPF, so it'd be dynamic resource. Mm-hmm. But for Windows Store or phone, it'll be a static resource lookup. It's just this the resource extensions, and then scroll to the top of the page. So to the top of the page, I will have here where you have the header style, and then add a property there.
Adding a property, sure.
Or change the font or do something.
Yeah, so I can say here the foreground goes to green now.
Yep.
Here we go, and now
everything is trickling down. Mm-hmm. So if this style was defined at app.xaml, and you had 50 pages, everybody will trickle down. Absolutely. And that's the benefit of style.
That's the benefit, yeah.
Yep, exactly. And these styles too can also do something like within the style where right now you have foreground equals green, you could actually have that be a reference to a static resource like a brush.
Yes.
And then things could compose on each other.
Absolutely.
So
by the way, we can show that quickly, right? So here I have my text block. Let's go and edit here the style, edit current, right? I want to edit the current style. Now here I have this foreground which is set locally. I have the small white peg. White means it's here in the context of where I am. I can very easily go and say convert to new resource.
Yep.
And then I'm going to say this is a header brush. Here we go. And now notice that here it changed. So let's take a look into the XAML. What I did here is that I have my foreground property which is set to header brush. Again, don't get confused with dynamic resource. It's very much the same as static resource for most usages, I would say. And then the header brush itself is defined somewhere else, in that case here, just above, and it has the color green.
Yep.
Okay?
And what you could do now is drag a button onto the scene.
Yes, good call. So I'm going to take, let's just take a new button here. And now if I want to say, now I want the foreground here to also be header style, I can easily go and set the foreground property of the button here to local resource, header brush, and now my button is green as well.
And if you change in this, brush definition,
now let's see that. So now I wanted to show quickly here the resources panel, because it's a panel which is actually pretty useful, and I heard that a lot of people don't know about it. This is a brush that I have defined. I can directly here edit it. So for example, I can say now I want this to be purple, okay? And notice that this changed here in the button, but also here in my header. And within the resource panel, I can also move resources around, which is very convenient. For example, if I have a resource dictionary, I can take it. Or let's say that I want to change the name, okay? This is used in at least 2 locations. I want to say this is my brush now. And now Blend is going to tell me, hey, by the way, be careful, because header brush is used by other elements. What do you want to do? Do you want to update the references? Mostly it's yes, but sometimes you have some special scenarios where you want to actually break it. So now I change the name, and everywhere my XAML elements have been, my XAML files have been updated.
Yep, okay? Perfect.
Cool, so that was the style scenario. We're going to go quickly to the Visual State Manager, but I think that we talked about it already quite a lot. So again, as a recap, inside a control, we define template visual state attributes. They always have a group name so that they can be grouped together, and within that group be mutually exclusive. And then they have a name. So here in that case for the button, we have pressed, mouse over, normal, and disabled. But think about it. It's possible that the button is focused and has a mouse over, or that it's unfocused and has a mouse over. So those can be combined. Yep. You can have transitions. I showed that into Blend. You can edit. By the way, it can get complicated quite fast. So if I take a look inside the XAML, inside the template of my button, so you see that, like for example, here's the scroll bar. Okay, so we have probably about a good 100 lines of XAML, right? So that's why really tools help you tremendously. XAML was created with Blend in mind, okay? Blend came really from the start, and this is really a tremendous help. And if you see the visual state, so here we have the visual state for the controls that I created before. The way it works is that you have Visual State Manager.Visual State Groups, which is an attached properties, and then you have the groups, and then you have, for each one, you have here the transition. So remember I set here 0.5 seconds and 0.2 seconds. If I wanted to write my visual state by hand, this is what I would have to write. I don't know anybody who actually does it, to be honest, or maybe for very, very simple ones. I'm sure that there are like 10 people shouting, I do that by hand. Kudos to you guys. Oh, he does that by hand. Absolutely. But no, seriously, really take advantage of the tool. The tool is free now, so it's really very good. All right, visual states. So here is an example. You have the hover, you have the click, you have another thing for WPF. In WPF, it looks very different, but it's actually exactly the same control. It has the same state. The checkbox is governed by visual state, so you have a checked state, or it's actually called toggle state, I believe. And even complex scenarios, like you have Skype, which is taking the full screen, but then suddenly you go into Snap View. And this is something that we actually do in WinRT development with states. We say, hey, now we go into the snapped state, and then we switch templates, or we decide, now this element is going to be hidden, this element is going to be shown. So you can have some really advanced scenarios using visual states. It's very, very powerful.
Yep.
Visual State Manager, I showed that already. This is just as a recap. And I don't think that we need an additional demo. We already saw quite a lot of that. We are slightly over time anyway. So that's what I had in order to build controls, build styles, build templates. And here I think we see already a level higher than the foundation that we did before. How do you use actually all this goodness in order to build a very customizable experience?
Yeah, here's where everything comes together for me, where we start seeing the resources, the visual trees, the dependency properties, all those things just come together to create these very complex visualizations. And the one thing that I think we should say is that, again, most people will be in really great shape by just dragging and dropping the controls. Like a lot of people can write a great Windows Phone or Windows Store app by just dragging and dropping the controls and using layout. Right now, if people have a strong brand and they want to brand their app, they're going to just go in there and drag and drop the controls, and they're going to apply some styles, and that's it.
Yeah.
Right. Very few people have to get into the control template mechanism.
Absolutely.
So
no,
it's a very gradual. Like there's a lot more you can do.
No, it's really the cooking experience, right? You're at home and you're hungry and you whip up a quick omelette with 3 eggs, right? Or you go to the restaurant and to the fast food and you have somebody who does that all day long, and maybe the omelette has a different taste, which is why you go there. But it's still not great cuisine, right? And then after that, you have guys who really go into templates, and do the whole customization, and that would be your 5-star restaurant where, you spend more time doing that, but in the end, you have really a result which is exactly what you were expecting and what you were hoping for.
To use your analogy, I'm more of I'm at home, I go get the phone, I dial somebody and say, this is what I need. And that's a good plug for, we have a lot of control vendors.
Yeah.
Right, so Telerik, Infragistics, Component One. If you're writing phones, or phone Windows, WPF app, there's a lot of controls out there. So if you're not in that business, if you're a line of business developer, if you're the application developer, really getting down, again, I go back, getting down to writing a lot of controls is probably not what we want you to be doing.
I tend to agree with you. And by the way, if you want to customize your experience even more, you can always call us. For example, we do that all day long. We work with people and customize the experience exactly like they want. It's kind of the high cuisine thing without wanting to praise ourselves, but this is what we do, right? Exactly. As opposed to, quickly dragging and dropping, which allows you to create exactly what you want, but maybe it's not going to look exactly like you want.
And the last thing that I would tell people to close this session would be, there's a lot of open source out there. Like one thing that Microsoft has done in the last few years is that we've been shipping releases so fast that in some cases we couldn't get everything in the box. For example, for Windows 8, we have this library out there called Callisto, which we need in order for to get certain controls like as fly out or certain controls that are core to the experiences. Same thing for phone. We had a Windows Phone controls toolkit.
Yeah, so if you go to Silverlight Toolkit, so silverlight.codeplex.com.
Can you get it?
Exactly, and you go and see here you have the Windows Phone toolkit. You also have a toolkit for Silverlight. This is a great model which started with Silverlight, that they were really shipping controls out of band, meaning not with the usual release of the big framework, which takes longer. But here you have some very fast iterations, and you get some really good content. And there is also here, if you go and download the source code and run it, you have also samples. You have really everything you need to run it. Callisto is, by our good friend Tim Huer. He's a great guy and he does amazing work, and it's open source. You can download it. You have a lot of really useful controls. Many of those controls, have to say, it's a little bit sad, kinda. Here's Tim. It's a little bit sad, kinda, that many of those controls are actually going to be obsolete in 8.1 because they have been actually integrated inside the native experience, right? But this is very useful to have people like that who, in advance, already take the advantage of what they know and release. And kudos for releasing that open source. It's really a great learning experience.
And his team, like he's in the Jupyter team building the controls, so he's okay.
Yeah, you'd think he doesn't have any free time, but he actually does code on the side.
And not only that, but he's aware of what's coming. And
absolutely,
But where I was going with pointing people to the open source is the fact that that's a really great way to learn.
Yeah.
Right. If you really want to go in and say, oh, I want to learn how a custom control is built, go open any of those libraries. You get the source, and you have all the pieces that we just told you about. Templates, visual states, etc. So you can just go in there and learn.
Absolutely. So if you go here, for example, if you go back to my screen, right, I can really dive into the code and see, for example, the long list selectors that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. I actually have the implementation here in front of my eyes. So beautiful way to learn how to do things correctly. And you can read the code. You can really learn a lot about that. And you can even download the code and modify it for your own needs if you want. That's what open source is all about.
Yep. So.
All right.
Yep. So let's take a couple questions, and then we'll give them a 10-minute break. Let's see what we have here. There's a lot of questions. Any porting-related FAQ resources from Windows Phone 7 to Windows Phone 8? Matthias is answering questions today, so he might have a better link. Windows Phone 7 to Windows Phone 8 is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, there was really Windows Phone 8 is really an incremental iteration on top of Windows Phone 7. So Windows Phone 7, your applications are going to run as is. If you convert them to Windows Phone 8, then you're going to have the added value of having additional, additional behaviors, additional controls, additional sensors, etc., etc. But it's fairly straightforward. And in fact, when you upgrade, usually you can build, and it's going to build immediately.
Yep. We have what's the difference between attached property and dependency property, and so they're both dependency properties to begin with. So an attached property is still a dependency property. Attached, it just comes down to who the owner is. Remember when I did register attached, one of the types that you pass into it is the actual owner, the type that owns that. So that's pretty much the main difference from a lower level infrastructure point of view. From the high level, what you're doing is the syntax that your consumers are going to use is different. One of them is against your instance, against the instance of the object they're working with. So for example, I can say button.width, and that's the width inside that button, and the other one is going to be inside the button. I can do something like grid.setRow, pass the button instance, and then the value. So it just comes down to how you access it. A rule of thumb for me is that, the way I think about it is the attached dependency properties are usually for panels. It's usually for somebody else who needs to be owning a behavior that you don't own within your control. So again, outside of panels, you're not going to have that many instances of those.
Yeah, there are some very interesting scenarios where you can have attached properties, used to do some really interesting scenarios. Like, for example, the behaviors, which many people heard of, probably don't want to go too deep into the details, but are based on that, right? But basically, the way that I explain attached properties normally is that it's because you don't want to have to re-implement the same thing on every control, on every element that you have in the whole of WPF or the whole of Silverlight or the whole of Windows Phone. So instead, you have one class which owns that property, and it's going to attach that property to somebody else. That's the way that we usually explain that.
Yep. There's a question here. What have we done for 8.1? We just had built 3 weeks ago. We were down there in San Francisco, and Tim Hewer had a really great session on what's new in XAML. Session. Actually, there was a lot of really great sessions. There was one new in what's new in HTML, what's new in DirectX. So for that, I'm going to point people to channel 9. Go look for Build 2013 and check out the what's new in XAML. We're going to cover a little bit of that later, where we brought all the controls. We did a lot of optimizations. But for the person asking, do we have a kind of a summary of what's new in 8.1? Go check out that build session.
Yeah, and
that's a must-have.
It's a good introductory session. It's a great introductory session, which is then pointing to some more specialized session if you have something that you're really particularly interested in.
Yep. And somebody asked, are we running 8.1? Yes, I'm running 8.1.
I have 8.1 of my both machine, on my RT, which is here, and on my Surface Pro, which I'm remoted into. I'm actually giving all my demos into a Surface Pro, by the way. So you see that you can do some serious development on a very small portable machine and with a lot of power.
Yep. I don't quite understand this one. Let's see. Can XAML support a strong type? That's a POCO representation of a table of some database. You can do that in ASP.NET, but using item type. So
I'm not quite sure what that means.
Type. Let's leave that one open for data binding, which is coming next. And if I haven't answered that, then try to reword it so I understand it better. We're going to cover data binding next, which is which is very strong type.
Okay. I don't want to guess what it says. Bindings, you work very often by name, right? So you get the name of a property and all that. But there is a lot of help in Visual Studio 2013 around that, with a very improved IntelliSense, where you can really take an element and then ... into that, so you have a nice experience there.
Yep. And then I'll take this one more, and then we'll leave a few for later. So for those that still have some, we'll eventually get to all of them. But I gotta cut it and give people a break. So this one is interesting because we haven't done these a lot. So this is our fault. Somebody's asking, hey, you're using Blend. Does all that, how does that happen in Visual Studio?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so pretty much, and the reason is that I'm a Blend freak, right? So hey, Uni, I mean, Blend is a fantastic app, but a lot of what we did here, you can actually do in Visual Studio. And if you go...
And the one thing for people to know is that, you know, and I'll show you, and I'll definitely make a point of showing you when we get to data binding next, is everything that we're doing on one tool or the other is saving onto the other one. So on the data binding demo, I'll make sure that I have both open, and you'll be able to see that I can go into Blend, make changes, and then when I come back to Visual Studio will say, hey, you just made some changes. Let's go ahead and, you know, bring them in. Do you want to bring them in? And then you say yes, and everything stays in sync.
That's correct. Yeah. If you give me the focus here on my computer very quickly. Yep. So here I have the same application open in Blend, and if I actually save now, so now I have those two buttons, and I go back. Well, there is this small, little bit annoying bug, but basically it's going to detect, it's going to reload, and then I will have a very, very similar experience here on this design surface. The only thing you cannot do in Visual Studio are visual state editing, that you have to have Blend, and animations. I think that it's pretty much the only thing that you can do. If you take a button, drag it, and then right-click, you can actually go ahead, edit template, edit a copy, just like I did before. It's the exact same experience, and you see that the properties panel may look very familiar. It's because under the cover, it's really Blend running. My personal preference is to do the visual editing into an application which looks a little bit like a design, which looks more like a design tool, and to do the code editing in an application which looks more like a code editing tool, but it's really my personal preference.
Yep. So let's give people a 10-minute break. I think we go offline again, and then we'll be back in 10 minutes. So next is data binding.
Yes. And you're going to be talking a lot this time.
Yeah, I'll be doing the talking next time. And it'll be just being 10 minutes, and we'll go.
All right. See you guys.